Holmes had been seated for some hours in silence, with his long, thin back curved over a chemical vessel in which he was brewing a particularly malodorous product. His head was sunk upon his breast, and he looked from my point of view like a strange, lank bird with dull gray plumage and a black top knot.
So, Watson, you do not propose to invest in South African securities?
I gave a start of astonishment. Accustomed as I was to Holmes's curious faculties, this sudden intrusion into my most intimate thoughts was utterly inexplicable. How on earth do you know that?
Now, Watson, confess yourself utterly taken back.
I am.
I ought to make you sign a paper to that effect.
Why?
Because in 5 minutes you'll say that it's also absurdly simple.
I'm sure that I shall say nothing of the kind.
You see, my dear Watson, it's not really difficult to construct a series of inferences, each dependent upon its predecessor, and each simple in itself. If after doing so one simply knocks out all the central inferences and presents one's audience with a starting point and a conclusion, one may produce a startling, though a possibly meretricious effect. Now it is not really very difficult, by an inspection of the groove between your left forefinger and thumb, to feel sure that you did not propose to invest your small capital in the goldfields.
I see no connection.
Very likely not, but I can quickly show you a close connection. Here are the missing links with a very simple chain. You had chalk between your left finger and thumb when you returned from the club last night. You put chalk there when you played billiards instead of the cue. You've never played billiards except with Thurston. You told me 4 weeks ago that Thurston had an option on some South African property which would expire in a month and which he desired you to share with him. Your checkbook is locked in my drawer, and you have not asked for the key. You do not propose to invest your money in that manner.
How absurdly simple.
Quite so. Every problem becomes very childish when once is explained to you. Here's an unexplained one. See what you make of that, friend Watson.
He tossed a sheet of paper upon the table and turned once more to his chemical analyses. I looked with amazement at the absurd hieroglyphics upon the paper. Why, Holmes, it's a child's drawing.
Oh, that's your idea?
What else should it be?
That is what Mr. Hilton Cubbett of Rydenthorpe Manor, Norfolk, is very anxious to know. This little conundrum came by the first post, and it was to follow by the next train. There's a ring at the bell, Watson. I should not be very much surprised if it were he.
A heavy step was heard upon the stairs, and an instant later there entered a tall, ruddy gentleman, whose clear eyes and florid cheeks told of a life led far from the fogs of Baker Street. Having shaken hands with each of us, his eye rested upon the paper with the curious markings.
Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of these? They told me that you were fond of queer mysteries, and I don't think you can find a much queerer one than this. I sent the paper on ahead so that you might have time to study it before I came.
It is certainly rather a curious production. At first sight, it would appear to be some childish prank. It consists of a number of absurd little figures dancing across the paper upon which they are drawn. Why should you attribute any importance to so grotesque an object?
I never should, Mr. Holmes, but my wife does. It is frightening her to death. She says nothing, but I can see the terror in her eyes. That's why I want to sift the matter to the bottom.
Holmes held up the paper so that the sunlight shone full upon it. It was a page torn from a notebook. The markings were done in pencil and ran in this way. Holmes examined it for some time, and then, folding it carefully up, he placed it in his pocketbook.
This promises to be a most interesting and unusual case. You gave me a few particulars in your letter, but I would be very much obliged if you would kindly go over it all again for the benefit of my friend Dr. Watson.
I'll begin at the time of my marriage last year, but I want to say first of all that though I'm not a rich man, my people have been at Rydenthorpe for a matter of 5 centuries, and there is no better known family in the county of Norfolk. Last year I came up to London for the Jubilee, and I stopped at a boarding house in Russell Square because the vicar of our parish, Parker, was staying in it. There was an American young lady there. Patrick was the name, Elsie Patrick. In some way we became friends, until before my month was up, I was as much in love as man could be. We were quietly married at a registry office, and we returned to Norfolk a wedded couple. You'll think it very mad that a man of good old family should marry a wife in this fashion, knowing nothing of her past or of her people. In fact, she gave me every chance of getting out of it if I wished to do so.
I've had some very disagreeable associations in my life. I wish to forget all about them. I would rather never allude to the past, for it is very painful to me. If you take me, you will take a woman who has nothing that she need be personally ashamed of, but you will have to be content with my word for it, and to allow me to be silent as to all that passed up to the time when I became yours. If these conditions are too hard, then go back to Norfolk, and leave me to the lonely life in which you found me."
It was only the day before our wedding that she said those very words to me. I told her that I was content to take her on her own terms, and I have been as good as my word. But about a month ago, my wife received a letter from America. I saw the American stamp. She turned deadly white, read the letter, and threw it into the fire. Well now, I come to the queer part of my story. About a week ago, it was Tuesday of last week, I found on one of the windowsills a number of absurd little dancing figures like the ones upon the paper. They were scrawled with chalk. I thought it was the stable boy who had drawn them, but the lad swore he knew nothing about it. Anyhow, they had come there during the night. I had washed them out, and I had only mentioned the matter to my wife afterwards. To my surprise, she took it very seriously and begged me, if any more came, to let her see them. None did come for a week. And then yesterday morning I found this paper lying on the sundial in the garden. I showed it to Elsie, and down she dropped in a dead faint. Since then she has looked like a woman in a dream, half dazed and with terror always looking in her eyes. It was then that I wrote and sent the paper to you, Mr. Holmes. I am not a rich man, but if there is any danger threatening my little woman, I would spend my last copper to shield her.
Don't you think, Mr. Cubbett, that your best plan would be to make a direct appeal to your wife and to ask her to share her secret with you?
A promise is a promise, Mr. Holmes. If Elsie wished to tell me, she would. If not, it is not for me to force her confidence. But I am justified in taking my own line, and I will.
Then I will help you with all my heart. In the first place, have you heard of any strangers being seen in your neighborhood?
No.
I presume that it is a very quiet place. Any fresh face would cause comment?
In the immediate neighborhood, yes. But we have several small watering places not very far away, and the farmers take in lodgers.
These hieroglyphics have evidently a meaning. If it's a purely arbitrary one, it may be impossible for us to solve it. If, on the other hand, it's systematic, I have no doubt that we shall get to the bottom of it. But this particular sample is so short that I can do nothing, and the facts which you have brought me are so indefinite that we have no basis for the investigation. I would suggest that you return to Norfolk, that you keep a keen lookout, and that you take an exact copy of any fresh dancing men which may appear. It is a thousand pities that we have not a reproduction of those which were done in chalk upon the windowsill. When you have collected some fresh evidence, come to me again. This is the best advice which I can give you. If there are any pressing fresh developments, I shall always be ready to run down and see you in your Norfolk home.
The interview left Sherlock Holmes very thoughtful, and several times in the next few days I saw him take his slip of paper from his notebook and look long and earnestly at the curious figures inscribed upon it. He made no allusion to the affair until one afternoon, a fortnight or so later.
You'd better stay here, Watson.
Why?
Because I had a wire from Hilton Cubbett this morning. You remember Hilton Cubbett of the Dancing Men? He was to reach Liverpool Street at 1:20. He may be here any moment.
We had not long to wait, for our Norfolk squire came straight from the station as fast as a hansom could bring him. He was looking worried and depressed, with tired eyes and a lined forehead.
I have several fresh dancing men pictures for you to examine, and what is more important, I have seen the fellow.
What? The man who draws them?
Yes, I saw him at his work, but I will tell you everything in order. When I got back after my visit to you, the very first thing I saw next morning was a fresh crop of dancing men. They had been drawn in chalk upon the black wooden door of the tool house, which stands beside the lawn in full view of the front windows. I took an exact copy, and here it is.
Excellent, excellent. Pray continue.
When I had taken the copy, I rubbed out the marks, but 2 mornings later a fresh inscription had appeared. I have a copy of it here. After that, I had determined to lie in wait, so I got out my revolver and I sat up in my study, which overlooks the lawn and garden. About 2 in the morning, I was seated by the window, all being dark save for the moonlight outside, when I heard steps behind me, and there was my wife in her dressing gown. She implored me to come to bed. I told her frankly that I wished to see who it was who played such absurd tricks upon us. She answered that it was some senseless practical joke, and that I should not take any notice of it.
If it really annoys you, Hilton, we might go and travel, you and I, and so avoid this nuisance.
Suddenly as she spoke, I saw her white face grow whiter yet in the moonlight, and her hand tightened upon my shoulder. Something was moving in the shadow of the tool house. Seizing my pistol, I was rushing out when my wife threw her arms round me and held me with convulsive strength. I tried to throw her off, but she clung to me most desperately. At last I got clear, but by the time I had opened the door and reached the house, the creature was gone. He had left a trace of his presence, however, for there on the door was the very same arrangement of dancing men.
Have you that fresh drawing?
Yes, it is very short, but I made a copy of it, and here it is.
Tell me, was this a mere addition to the first, or did it appear to be entirely separate?
It was on a different panel of the door.
Excellent. This is by far the most important of all for our purpose. It fills me with hopes. Now please continue your most interesting statement.
I have nothing more to say, except that I was angry with my wife that night for having held me back when I might have caught the skulking rascal.
I fear it is too deep a case for such simple remedies. How long can you stay in London?
I must go back today. I would not leave my wife alone all night for anything. She was very nervous and begged me to come back.
The moment that Hilton's broad back had disappeared through the door, my comrade rushed to the table, laid out all the slips of paper containing dancing men in front of him. For 2 hours I watched him as he covered sheet after sheet of paper with figures and letters, so completely absorbed in his task that he had evidently forgotten my presence. Finally, he sprang from his chair with a cry of satisfaction and walked up and down the room, rubbing his hands together. Then he wrote a long telegram upon a cable form. But there was a delay in that answering telegram, and 2 days of impatience followed, during which Holmes pricked up his ears at every ring of the bell. On the second evening, there was a letter from Hilton Cubitt. All was quiet with him, save that a long inscription had appeared that morning upon the pedestal of the sundial. He enclosed a copy of it, which is here reproduced. Holmes bent over this grotesque frieze for some minutes, and then suddenly sprang to his feet with an exclamation of surprise and dismay. His face was haggard with anxiety.
Our presence is most urgently needed. This message makes it even more essential that we should not lose an hour in letting Hilton Cubitt know how matters stand, for it is singular and a dangerous web in which our simple Norfolk squire is entangled.
So indeed it proved, and as I come to the dark conclusion of a story which had seemed to me to be only childish and bizarre, I experience once again the dismay and horror with which I was filled. Would that I had some brighter ending to communicate to my readers, but these are the chronicles of fact, and I must follow to their dark crisis the strange chain of events which for some days made Ridingthorpe Manor a household word throughout the length and breadth of England. We had hardly alighted at North Walsham and mentioned the name of our destination when the station master hurried towards us. "I suppose that you're the detectives from London?" "It's a terrible business," said the station master. "They're shot, both Mr. Hilton Cubitt and his wife. She shot him and then herself, so the servants say." Without a word, Holmes hurried to a carriage, and during the long 7 miles drive he never opened his mouth. As we walked up to the porticoed front door, a dapper little man with a quick, alert manner had just descended. He introduced himself as Inspector Martin, and he was considerably astonished when he heard the name of my companion. Inspector Martin had the good sense to allow my friend to do the things in his own fashion, and contented himself with carefully noting the results. The local surgeon, who had just come down from Mrs. Hilton Cubitt's room, and he reported that her injuries were serious, but not necessarily fatal.
Has he been moved?
We have moved nothing except the lady. We cannot leave her lying wounded upon the floor.
You have acted with great discretion. Who sent for you?
The housemaids.
Then I think we had better hear their story at once.
The old hall, oak-paneled and high-windowed, had been turned into a court of investigation. The two women told their story clearly enough. They'd been aroused from their sleep by the sound of an explosion, which had been followed by a minute later a second one. The door of the study was open, and a candle was burning upon the table. Their master lay upon his face in the center of the room. He was quite dead. Near the window his wife was crouching, her head leaning against the wall. She was horribly wounded, and the side of her face was red with blood. The window was certainly shut and fastened upon the inside. Both women were positive upon the point. They were also clear that every door was fastened upon the inside, and that no one could have escaped from the house.
And now I think that we are in a position to undertake a thorough examination of the room.
Our first attention was given to the body of the unfortunate squire, whose huge frame lay stretched across the room. The bullet had been fired at him from the front and had remained in his body after penetrating the heart. His death had certainly been instantaneous and painless. There was no powder marking either upon his dressing gown or on his hands. According to the country surgeon, the lady had stains upon her face, but none upon her hand.
The absence of the latter means nothing, though its presence may mean everything. Unless the powder from a badly fitting cartridge happens to spurt backwards, one may fire many shots without leaving a sign. I suppose the doctor has not recovered the bullet which wounded the lady.
A serious operation will be necessary before that can be done. But there are still 4 cartridges in the revolver. 2 have been fired and 2 wounds inflicted, so that each bullet can be accounted for.
So it would seem, perhaps you can account also for the bullet which has so obviously struck the edge of the window.
He had turned suddenly, and his long, thin finger was pointing to a hole which had been drilled right through the lower window sash, about an inch above the bottom.
You are certainly right, sir. Then the 3rd shot has been fired, and therefore a 3rd person must have been present. But who could that have been, and how could he have got away?
Feeling sure that the window has been open at the time of the tragedy, I conceive that there might have been a 3rd person in the affair, who stood outside this opening and fired through it. Any shot directed at the person might hit the sash. I looked, and there, sure enough, was the bullet mark.
But how came the window to be shut and fastened?
The woman's first instinct would be shut and fasten the window. But hello, what is this?
It was a lady's handbag which stood upon the study table, a trim little handbag of crocodile skin and silver. Holmes opened it and turned the contents out. There were 20 50-pound notes of the Bank of England, held together by an India rubber band, nothing else.
I rather think, Inspector Martin, that we have now exhausted all this room can teach us. If you will kindly step round with me, we shall see what fresh evidence the garden has to offer.
A flower bed extended up to the study window, and we all broke into an exclamation as we approached it. The flowers were trampled down, and the soft soil was imprinted all over with footmarks. Large, masculine feet they were, with peculiarly long, sharp toes. Holmes hunted about among the grass and leaves like a retriever after a wounded bird. Then, with a cry of satisfaction, he bent forward and picked up a little brazen cylinder.
I thought so. The revolver had an ejector, and here's the 3rd cartridge. I really think, Inspector Martin, that our case is almost complete. I have the threads of this affair all in my hand. First of all, I wish to know whether there are any inns in this neighborhood known as Eldridge's.
The servants were cross-questioned, but none of them had heard of such a place. The stable boy threw a light upon the matter by remembering that a farmer of that name lived some miles off in the direction of East Ruston. Holmes thought for a little, and then a curious smile played over his face.
Saddle a horse. I shall wish you to take a note to Eldridge's farm.
He took from his pocket the various slips of the dancing men. With these in front of him, he studied and worked at the table for some time. Finally, he handed a note to the boy with directions to put it into the hands of the person to whom it was addressed, and especially to answer no questions of any sort which might be put to him. When the youth had been dispatched with the note, Sherlock Holmes gave his instructions to the servants. If any visitor were to call asking for Mrs. Hilton Cubbett, no information should be given as to her condition, but he was to be shown at once into the drawing room. He impressed upon these points upon him with the utmost earnestness.
I think that I can help to pass an hour in an interesting and profitable manner. I'm fairly familiar with all forms of secret writings, and am myself the author of a trifling monograph upon the subject, in which I analyze 160 separate ciphers. But I confess this is entirely new to me. The object of those who invented this system has apparently been to conceal that these characters convey a message, and to give the idea that they're the mere random sketches of children. Having once recognized, however, that the symbol stood for letters, and having applied the rules which guide us in all forms of secret writings, the solution was easy enough. The first message submitted to me was so short that it was impossible for me to do more than to say with some confidence that the symbol X stood for E, as you are aware. E is the most common letter in the English alphabet, and even in short sentences, one would expect to find it most often. Out of 15 symbols in the first message, 4 were the same, so it was reasonable to set this down as E. It is true that in some cases the figure was bearing a flag, and some cases not, but it was probable from the way in which the flags were distributed that they were used to break the sentence up into words. I accepted this as a hypothesis and noted that E was represented by X. I therefore waited for fresh material in my second interview with Mr. Hilton Cubitt. He was able to give me 2 other short sentences, and one message which appeared, since there was no flag, to be a single word. Even now I was in considerable difficulty, but a happy thought put me in the possession of several other letters. It occurred to me that if these appeals came, as I expected, from someone who had been intimate with a lady in early life, a combination which contained 2 E's with 3 letters between might very well stand for the name Elsie. On examination, I found that such a combination formed the termination of a message, which were 3 times repeated. It's certainly some appeal to Elsie. In this way, I had gotten my L, S, and I. But what appeal could it be? There were only 4 letters in the word which preceded Elsie, and it ended in E. Surely the word must be come. I tried all other 4 letters ending in E, but could find none to fit the case. So now I was in possession of C, O, and M, and I was in the position to attack the first message once more, dividing it into words and putting dots for each symbol, which was still unknown. So treated, it worked out in this fashion: M, E, R, E, E, S, L, and E. Now the first letter can only be A, which is a most useful discovery, since it occurs no fewer than 3 times in the short sentence. And the H is also apparent in the second word. Now it becomes am here A.E. slain, or filling in the obvious vacancies in the name am here Abe Slaney.
Inspector Martin and I had listened with the utmost interest to the full and clear account of how my friend had produced results which had led to so complete a command over our difficulties.
What did you do then, sir?
I had every reason to suppose that this Abe Slaney was an American, since Abe is an American contraction, and since a letter from America had been the starting point of all the trouble. I also had every cause to think that there was some criminal secret in the matter. The lady's allusion to her past and her refusal to take her husband into her confidence both pointed in that direction. I therefore cabled to my friend Wilson Hargrave of the New York Police Bureau, who has more than once made use of my knowledge of London crime. I asked him whether the name of Abe Slaney was known to him. Here is his reply: the most dangerous crook in Chicago. On the very evening upon which I had his answer, Hilton Cubitt sent me the last message from Slaney. Working with known letters, it took this form: LCRER to meet thy go. The addition of a P and a D completed a message which showed me that the rascal was proceeding from persuasion to threat, and my knowledge of the crooks of Chicago prepared me to find that he might be very rapidly put his words into action. I at once came to Norfolk with my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, but unhappily only in time to find that the worst had already occurred.
It is a privilege to be associated with you in the handling of a case. You will excuse me, however, if I speak frankly to you. You are only answerable to yourself, but I have to answer to my superiors. If this Abe Slaney, living at Elridge's, is indeed the murderer, and if he has made his escape while I am seated here, I should certainly get into serious trouble.
You need not be uneasy. He will not try to escape.
How do you know?
I expect him here every instant.
Why should he come?
Because I have written and asked him.
A man was striding up the path which led to the door. He was a tall, handsome fellow, clad in a suit of black flannel, a great, aggressive hooked nose, and flourishing a cane as he walked. He swaggered up a path as if the place belonged to him, and we heard his loud, confident peal at the bell.
I think, gentlemen, that we had best take up our position behind the door. Every precaution is necessary with dealing with such a fellow. You will need your handcuffs, Inspector. You can leave the talking to me.
We waited in silence for a minute, one of those minutes which one can never forget. Then the door opened and the man stepped in. In an instant, Holmes clapped a pistol to his head and Martin slipped the handcuffs over his wrists. It was all done so swiftly and deftly that the fellow was helpless before he knew that he was attacked. He glared from one to the other of us with a pair of blazing black eyes.
Well, gentlemen, you have the drop on me this time. I seem to have knocked against something hard. But I came in here in answer to a letter from Miss Hilton Cubitt. Don't tell me that she is in this. Don't tell me that she helped to set a trap for me.
Miss Hilton Cubitt was seriously injured and is at death's door.
You're crazy. It was he that was hurt, not she. Who would have hurt little Elsie? I may have threatened her, God forgive me, but I would have not touched a hair on her pretty head. Take it back, you. Say that she is not hurt.
She was found badly wounded by the side of her dead husband.
The lady is hurt as bad as you say. Who was it that wrote this note?
I wrote it to bring you here.
You wrote it? There was no one out on earth outside the joint that knew the secret of the dancing men. How came you to write it?
What one man can invent, another can discover.
She had been engaged to me, and she would have married me, I believe, if I had taken another profession. It was only after her marriage to this Englishman that I was able to find out where she was. I wrote to her, but got no answer. I tried all I could to coax Elsie away. She sent me a letter imploring me to go away. She said that she would come down when her husband was asleep and speak with me through the end window if I would go away afterwards and leave her in peace. She came down and brought money with her, trying to bribe me to go. That moment in rushed the husband with his revolver in his hand. Elsie had sunk down upon the floor, and we were face to face. I held up my gun to scare him off and let me get away. He fired and missed me. I pulled off almost at the same instant, and down he dropped. I made a way across the garden. As I went, I heard the window shut behind me.
A cab had driven up whilst the American had been talking. 2 uniformed policemen sat inside. Inspector Martin rose and touched his prisoner on the shoulder. We stood at the window and watched the cab drive away. As I turned back, my eye caught the pellet of paper which the prisoner had tossed upon the table. It was the note with which Holmes had decoyed him. It contained no word, but this little line of dancing men.
If you use the code, you'll find that it simply means, come here at once. I was convinced that it was an invitation which he could not refuse, since he could never imagine that it would come from anyone but the lady. And so, my dear Watson, we have ended by turning the dancing men to good when they have so often been the agents of evil.
Only one word of epilogue. The American Abe Slaney was condemned to death at the winter assizes at Norwich, but his penalty was changed to penal servitude in consideration of mitigating circumstances and the certainty that Hilton Cubitt had fired the first shot. Of Mrs. Hilton Cubitt, I only know that I've heard she recovered entirely, and that she still remains a widow, devoting her whole life to the care of the poor and to the administration of her husband's estate.